A river in the middle of Indiana just beat a record that had stood since 1913, 24.93 feet at Anderson, against an old mark of 23.6 that survived the entire 20th century. 6 people are dead, including a 4-year-old boy. 4,000 miles west at almost the same hour, a hurricane named Lala was pulling houses off their foundations in Hawaii without ever officially making landfall. 2 disasters, 2 ocean basins, 1 weekend, and no weather system in common. Nothing connects them on any map you could draw, and yet they killed in exactly the same way, and both broke a benchmark that everything around them was built on. So if those records were the ceiling, what is the ceiling now? If you want this with the real numbers in it, hit like and subscribe to the Skylab because the counts are still moving. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether the flood maps where you live have ever been redrawn. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The number that broke a century. 24.93 feet. That is where the White River stopped rising at Anderson, Indiana on Friday, August 14, 2026. It is a gauge reading, which means it is one of the least dramatic pieces of information a human being can look at. A number on a screen, updated every 15 minutes, sitting in a database that almost nobody outside of a hydrology office ever opens. And it is the most important number in this entire story because of the number it replaced. The old record at that gauge was 23.6 feet. It was set in 1913. It had stood unbeaten for 113 years. It survived 2 world wars, the entire 20th century, every storm that Indiana threw at that river for 4 generations, and it was the number that the maps and the levees and the insurance paperwork along that stretch of water were quietly built around. On Friday it lost by 1 foot and 4 inches. 15 miles upstream at Noblesville, the same river did the same thing to its own 1913 record. That gauge had held at 23.8 feet since the spring of that year. This week the forecast crest came in at 24.5, 2 gauges, 2 records, 1 river, 1 week. And while that was happening in the middle of Indiana, roughly 4,000 miles to the west, a hurricane named Lala was closing on the big island of Hawaii with maximum sustained winds of 75 miles an hour. It never officially made landfall. It grazed past, close enough to put hurricane conditions on the ground without ever technically arriving. And in a small community on the southern end of that island called Nalehu, 2 houses were swept away. So here is where we actually are. At least 6 people are dead in Indiana as of this recording, including a 4-year-old boy. 1 person is dead in Hawaii, killed in a storm-related vehicle crash. The Indianapolis Fire Department alone pulled 95 people and 45 pets out of the water by late Saturday afternoon. A search and rescue mission is still running on the Big Island. 2 federal emergencies, 2 ocean basins, 1 weekend. I want to be very clear about something before we go any further, because it shapes everything that follows. These 2 disasters have nothing to do with each other. There is no shared weather system. There is no synoptic connection. One is a tropical cyclone that spun up over warm Pacific water. The other is a mid-latitude frontal boundary that got stuck between a warm push from the Gulf and a cool push from Canada. If you put them on the same weather map, you would not be able to draw a line between them, because there is no line to draw. And yet they killed people in almost exactly the same way. Not with wind, not with lightning, not with anything that either of them would be famous for. They killed with water, delivered faster than the ground underneath could take it. That is the thread that runs through the next 2 hours, and I want you holding on to it, because it is the thing that makes 2 unrelated storms in the same week worth understanding together rather than separately. Let me also set an honest expectation about the numbers you are about to hear. This is a live story. As of Saturday, the official Indiana death toll was at least 5. As of Sunday, it was at least 6. People were still reported missing while I was putting this together. The Hawaii outage count roughly doubled inside a single afternoon. Every figure I give you carries an invisible timestamp on it, and some of them will be different by the time you watch this. I will flag the ones that matter. What I will not do is round anything up for effect because the real numbers are strange enough. Now, some of you have been here before on this exact story, and I want to give you the credit for that. Back on August 12th, in the video about the severe weather threat escalating across the country, we spent a section on the Ohio Valley. At that point, the National Weather Service office in Indianapolis had just changed its language on the White River. The forecast flooding at Muncie and at Anderson had been upgraded from moderate severity to major severity, and the duration had been extended. Law enforcement in Cambridge City, over in Wayne County, was reporting up to 5 feet of water sitting on roads. Indiana was carrying 44 active weather alerts, which at that moment was the highest total of any state in the country, ahead of Kentucky at 19 and Illinois at 18. And here is the detail from that video that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Those flood warnings had expiration times. Some of them ran all the way out to August 17th, which meant that forecasters were saying, in writing, in a public product 4 days before the fact, that the crest had not happened yet and would not happen for the better part of a week. They were right. That is the uncomfortable part. 4 days later, the crest arrived exactly where they said it would, and it broke a record set before the First World War. So when we come back to the question of whether anyone was warned, and we will come back to it, because the internet has some very confident opinions about that, I want you to remember that the warning was published, dated and specific. This was not a forecast failure. Which raises a much harder question about what exactly did fail, and we are going to spend a good deal of time on that. The instinct when you hear about 2 disasters in 1 week is to ask which one was worse. Which storm was stronger? Which one had the higher winds, the bigger footprint, the more dramatic satellite loop? That is the natural question, and it is the wrong one, and if you ask it, you will walk away from this story having learned nothing, because the honest answer is that neither of these was a strong storm. Lala was a Category 1. That is the bottom rung of the hurricane scale, the weakest classification that still counts as a hurricane at all, and the Indiana event was thunderstorms. Ordinary summer thunderstorms, the kind the Midwest produces by the thousand every year, the kind that generate the single most common severe weather warning in the American interior. A Category 1 and some thunderstorms. 6 dead in one state, 1 dead in another, a 113-year-old record on the floor, a federal emergency declaration signed, and tens of thousands of people sitting in the dark on a chain of islands in the middle of the Pacific. There is one more thing about the 1913 record I need to put in front of you now, because it is going to sit underneath everything in the next hour. The flood that set that record was not the same kind of flood at all. It happened in March. It happened in a completely different season, with a completely different water source, under completely different ground conditions. It had an ingredient that this week's flood did not have, and could not have had, and would never have in August. The 1913 flood had more to work with, substantially more, and it still lost. Once you understand what 1913 had that 2026 did not, the new number on that gauge stops reading like a record and starts reading like something else entirely. Let me show you. Part 2. 3 days of rain that would not move. The storms arrived in Indiana on August 11th. That part was completely unremarkable. Severe storms crossing Indiana on a hot, humid day in the middle of August is not news. It is a Tuesday. The Storm Prediction Center puts out risk areas for exactly this kind of setup, dozens of times each summer, and the vast majority of the time the storms come through, they drop an inch or two, they knock a few branches down, and by evening the whole thing is somebody else's problem 3 states east. What made this different was not what arrived. It was that it never left. Over the next 2 days, the National Weather Service recorded more than 11 inches of rain in parts of Indiana. In Newcastle, the measured total was 11.43 inches. In Greensburg, more than 7. Those numbers landed inside a narrow band, which is a detail I will come back to, because the shape of the rainfall turns out to matter almost as much as the amount. Let me try to make 11.43 inches mean something physical, because rainfall totals have a way of sliding past people as abstractions. An inch of rain falling on 1 square mile of ground is a little over 17 million gallons of water. So 11.5 inches across a single square mile is on the order of 200 million gallons. Now expand that across a watershed. The White River Basin above Indianapolis covers many hundreds of square miles. You're into the tens of billions of gallons, all of it arriving inside a window of about 48 hours, all of it needing somewhere to go, and gravity has exactly one suggestion about where. But here is the part that the total does not capture, and it is the part that decides whether you get a wet week or a disaster. It matters enormously what the ground was like when that rain started falling, and the ground in central Indiana was already loaded. The 11th through the 13th was not a single event dropped onto a dry landscape. It was the heaviest chapter in a sequence, arriving on soil that had already taken repeated rounds of storms in the days before. Think of soil as a sponge, which is roughly accurate. A dry sponge absorbs the first water you pour on it almost completely. A saturated sponge does not absorb anything. Everything you pour on it runs straight off the side. By the time the heaviest rain hit, central Indiana was a saturated sponge. Runoff efficiency was close to its maximum before the worst of it even started. That means a much higher percentage of every inch that fell went directly into creeks and ditches instead of soaking downward, which is the difference between a river rising and a river breaking a record. So why did it rain for 2 days in the same place? This is the mechanical heart of the Indiana story, and it comes down to one word: the front stopped. A front is a boundary between two air masses with different temperatures and different moisture content. Under normal conditions, fronts travel. They are pushed along by the larger scale flow in the upper atmosphere, the same steering currents that move weather systems from west to east across North America. And a typical front sweeps through your county in a matter of hours. Storms fire along it, the boundary moves on, the storms move with it, and the rain total anywhere along that track is limited by simple arithmetic. If the boundary is only overhead for 4 hours, you can only get 4 hours of rain. This front did not travel. Warm, humid air was pressing north out of the Gulf region. Cooler air was sitting to the north. Neither one could displace the other, so the boundary between them parked itself across the Midwest and simply stayed there, day after day, like a stalled car in an intersection, with traffic backing up behind it. That alone would not be enough. A stationary boundary with no moisture supply just sits there doing nothing. What turned this one into a disaster was what was feeding it. A high-pressure system positioned over the Gulf was acting as a pump. The circulation around a high in the northern hemisphere runs clockwise, which meant the western flank of that system was pushing warm, extremely humid air northward in a continuous stream. Meteorologists sometimes describe this as a conveyor belt, and the image is a good one, because a conveyor belt does not deliver a package and stop. It keeps delivering as long as it is running. This one was aimed directly at the stalled boundary over Indiana. Then came the third ingredient. Every time a disturbance moved along the jet stream and reached that boundary, it triggered a fresh round of thunderstorms. Not the same storms lingering. New storms forming, maturing, and dying, and then being replaced by new ones behind them. Each disturbance riding the jet was a new trigger pull on the same loaded gun. And the geometry of how those cells moved is the last piece, and it is the one with a name. The individual thunderstorm cells did not travel along the boundary. They tracked perpendicular to it, crossing it, one behind another, along nearly identical paths. Meteorologists call this training, and the metaphor is exactly what it sounds like. Picture a railway line, and picture the cars of a train passing over the same section of track, one after another after another. Each car is separate. Each car passes in under a minute. But if you are standing at that crossing, you are not there for 1 minute. You're there until the whole train is through. That is what happened to a narrow strip of Indiana counties for 2 days. Storm cells crossing the same ground, one behind another, each one dropping its inch or two, each one individually forgettable, and cumulatively producing a 2-day total that the National Weather Service measured above 11 inches. Run the arithmetic on the difference, and it is genuinely startling. A thunderstorm complex that crosses a county in 40 minutes and moves on might leave 3/4 of an inch. Deeply annoying, ruins a barbecue, no consequences. The same storms, with the same intensity and the same rainfall rates, regenerating over that county for 48 hours, produce 11.5. Same weather, same physics, same storms. All that changed was the geometry, and the geometry changed a nuisance into a fatal event. This is the first appearance of the idea that everything in this video is built on, so let me state it as plainly as I can. Nothing about these storms was individually extraordinary. Not one of them would have made a local news broadcast on its own. What was extraordinary was that they would not move. There is a way to see this happening on radar in real time, and once you know what you're looking at, you cannot unsee it. A normal convective day produces a scatter of cells drifting across the screen in the same general direction, appearing and dissolving, the whole field sliding along together. A training event looks entirely different. It looks like a single stationary stripe of colour laid across the map, and the stripe does not move for hours. Individual cells inside it are moving constantly, at 40 or 50 miles an hour, but they are all moving along the same line, so the line itself appears frozen. Forecasters see that signature and they know immediately what is about to happen to whatever is underneath it, and there is nothing whatsoever they can do about it except write the warning. The consequences of that stripe were already visible before the river got involved. Over in Wayne County, law enforcement in Cambridge City was reporting up to 5 feet of water standing on numerous roads while the rain was still falling. That is not river flooding. The White River was nowhere near those roads. That is water that fell out of the sky faster than the local drainage could carry it away, sitting on a road surface in a town, several days before the main stem crest that would eventually make the national news. Flash flooding and river flooding are two different disasters with two different clocks, and this event produced both, in sequence, from the same rain. And on Thursday, the rain finally eased. The river had not started yet. Part 3. What the water did to people. In Tipton County, they evacuated a mobile home community for seniors. I want to sit on that for a second because it is the kind of line that gets read out in a news bulletin in about 4 seconds and then disappears, and it should not. Evacuating that specific kind of community is one of the hardest things a local emergency response can be asked to do. You are moving people who may not drive, may use oxygen, may use a wheelchair, may be on dialysis with a schedule that cannot slip, may have a medication regimen that lives in a specific cabinet in a specific room. You are moving them out of housing that is structurally among the most vulnerable to both wind and water of anything built in the United States. And you are doing it in the dark, in the rain, on roads you may not be able to see the bottom of. That happened. It got about 1 line of coverage. The confirmed death toll across Indiana as of this recording is at least 6. On Saturday, the official figure was at least 5. By Sunday, it was at least 6. Several people were reported missing during the peak of the event. I am going to say clearly that this number may still change, and if it does, it will change upward, because that is the direction these counts move. Among the dead is a 4-year-old boy, and I want to be precise about how he died, because the shorthand versions of this story have been blurring it, and the details matter for understanding what these events actually do to people. He was not swept away. He was killed when a tree fell on his home. That is worth explaining, because it is a mechanism most people have never thought about. When soil is saturated for days, it does not just get muddy, it loses its shear strength. A tree does not stand up because it is heavy. A tree stands up because its roots are locked into a plate of soil that resists being tipped, and the strength of that resistance depends almost entirely on the soil being cohesive. Saturate it, and the soil around the root plate turns into something closer to a slurry. The tree has not changed at all. The anchor has. The practical result is that after several days of heavy rain, wind speeds that a tree shrugged off every summer of its life become enough to lay it over. Not a hurricane, not a tornado. Ordinary thunderstorm gusts, acting on a root plate sitting in mud. Trees come down in storms that would not have touched them a week earlier, and they come down onto the things that happen to be underneath them. Hold that mechanism in your head, because it is going to come back 4,000 miles away, in a completely different climate, doing a completely different kind of damage. On the rescue side, the numbers give you a sense of the scale. The Indianapolis Fire Department reported recovering 95 people and 45 pets by late Saturday afternoon. That is one department, in one city, in one afternoon. Across the wider Hamilton County corridor in the northern Indianapolis suburbs, the figure was reported at more than 90 people and 45 pets. These are boat rescues, from homes and from vehicles and from whatever high ground people managed to reach before the water closed behind them. In Fayette County, responders and volunteers were running rescues and welfare checks. A welfare check sounds administrative until you understand what it means during a flood. It means somebody has to physically get to a specific address to find out whether the person who lives there is alive, because the phone is not being answered, and the power is out, and the road is underwater. It is a boat trip to a front door. It is done house by house. There is no faster method. National Guard vehicles joined the response as conditions worsened, and there is a specific reason that matters beyond the optics of uniforms on a flooded street. High-clearance military vehicles can move through standing water that will drown a fire engine, and more importantly, they can survive hitting something they cannot see. Because that is the actual danger. It is not the water. It is that moving water scours the road out from underneath itself, and the surface you are driving on may have a 4-foot hole in it that is completely invisible under 18 inches of brown water. Which brings us to vehicles, and the single most common way that a flood kills a person in the United States. The physics here are not intuitive, which is precisely the problem. A typical car begins to lose traction and float in roughly 12 inches of water. That is 1 foot. Most people look at a foot of water on a road and read it as an inconvenience because they are thinking about depth, and depth is not what does it. Once the vehicle floats, it has no steering and no braking, because both of those functions depend entirely on the tyres being pressed against the road. Then add movement. Moving water exerts force proportional to the square of its velocity, which means that doubling the speed of the flow quadruples the force it applies to the side of your car. Water flowing at 6 miles an hour against the flank of a stationary vehicle is applying hundreds of pounds of lateral force continuously, and it does not get tired. The car does not tip over dramatically. It slides sideways, off the road, into the ditch that you could not see, and the ditch is where the water is deepest. That is how one person died in Hawaii this weekend as well, in a storm-related vehicle crash. Same failure mode, 4,000 miles apart, in a completely different disaster. And the reason people drive into it is not stupidity, which is the lazy explanation, and also the wrong one. It is that the road is familiar. You have driven it 10,000 times. You know it is flat, and you know there is nothing on it, and the water is brown, so you cannot see that the road you know is no longer there. The other thing that happens with a flood, and it is the reason the counts move the way they do, is that confirmation lags reality by days. During the peak, responders are doing rescues, not searches. The search only becomes possible when the water is low enough to enter the places the water was. So a toll that moves from 5 to 6 in 24 hours is not evidence of anything being hidden. It is evidence of an operation that has moved from one phase into the next. None of this required an extraordinary storm. That is the part I keep coming back to. It required ordinary storms that refused to leave, over a watershed that could not absorb them, in a place where people had every reason to believe they understood what their river was capable of. And while all of this was unfolding in the middle of Indiana, the second emergency was already organizing itself over open water, 4,000 miles to the west. Nobody watching the first one had any reason at all to be looking at the second. Part 4. The Declaration and the Machinery Behind It. The governor of Indiana declared a statewide disaster emergency and asked the federal government for help. President Trump approved an emergency declaration for the state. The Federal Emergency Management Agency confirmed that federal disaster assistance was available, and the figure attached to that declaration, the amount of federal resources it freed up, was up to $5 million. $5 million for a flood that broke a 113-year-old record across multiple counties, killed at least 6 people, and put entire neighborhoods underwater. I know how that number sounds. Before anyone gets angry at the wrong thing, that figure is not what it appears to be. And understanding why is genuinely useful, because this specific misunderstanding comes up after every single American disaster. There are 2 different federal declarations, and they do 2 completely different jobs. An emergency declaration is the fast one. It is designed to be issued during an event, sometimes before an event, to get federal resources moving immediately while the situation is still developing. It is capped, deliberately, because its purpose is speed rather than scale. It pays for emergency protective measures, search and rescue support, emergency operations center costs, debris removal that is blocking response. Its job is to keep the response running in the hours and days when nobody yet knows how bad this is. A major disaster declaration is the big one, and it is the slow one. That is the instrument that opens up individual assistance for households, temporary housing, grants for uninsured losses, low-interest disaster loans, and public assistance for rebuilding roads and bridges, and water treatment plants and public buildings. That is where the real money is, and that is what Indiana would need to actually recover rather than merely respond. So the $5 million is not a valuation of the disaster. It is the first instrument out of the box, issued while the water was still up, and the second instrument is a separate process that has not concluded. It is worth understanding what that first instrument actually buys, because the list is narrower than most people assume. Emergency protective measures means things like sandbagging, evacuation support, emergency shelter operation, and the overtime costs of the people running all of it. It can cover debris removal when the debris is blocking a response route, which is not the same as clearing a neighborhood. It can cover the cost of standing up and running an emergency operations center for as long as the emergency lasts. What it does not do, at all, is put money in the hands of a family whose house has 3 feet of river in it. That is a completely separate authority, and it has to be applied for separately. That process has a name, and it is the thing to watch over the next several weeks. It is called a Joint Preliminary Damage Assessment. Teams made up of federal, state and local officials go county by county and, in the most literal sense, walk it. They count damaged homes. They classify them by severity, from affected through minor and major to destroyed. They tally the public infrastructure, they estimate costs, and those estimates get compared against per capita damage thresholds that determine whether a state qualifies. There is a threshold structure sitting underneath all of that, and it explains why some disasters that look devastating on television do not qualify for the larger declaration. The assessment totals get measured against per capita damage indicators, which means the damage has to be large relative to the population and resources of the state being assessed. A given dollar figure of destruction in a small state clears the bar more easily than the same figure in a large one. It is a mechanism designed to identify when a disaster genuinely exceeds what a state can handle on its own, and it means the question is never simply how bad it was. The question is how bad it was compared to the capacity of the place it happened to, and here is where the timing gets awkward in a way that nobody designed and nobody can fix. The assessment cannot really begin until the water leaves, but the water leaves slowest exactly where the damage is worst. The properties that will drive the numbers are the last properties anyone can reach. So the measurement of the disaster is systematically delayed by the severity of the disaster, which means the paperwork that determines how much help arrives is always running behind the thing it is measuring. There is a second timing problem specific to this event, and it is one that people who have never lived on a large river do not intuit. A flood on a river system is not a moment. It is a wave that travels. The rain fell hardest on Wednesday. Anderson crested on Friday. Points downstream crested later still. That is not a delay in reporting. It is the physical behaviour of water moving through a drainage system, and it means that at any given moment during this event, some counties were flooding, some were cresting, and some were already draining. Emergency management was not responding to one flood. It was chasing a wave down a river, reallocating boats and crews and shelter capacity as the peak moved from one county to the next. Now multiply that. The White River main stem was not the only system under warning. Multiple river systems in Indiana were under flood warning simultaneously. That means a single state emergency management agency was tracking several independent crests on several different clocks in several different parts of the state, while also running rescues, coordinating National Guard deployment, managing shelters, and preparing a federal aid request. All at once, all on the same staff, and every piece of that machinery has the same characteristic. It is calibrated against the past. Shelter capacity is planned against historical evacuation numbers. Levee design is set against historical crests. Floodplain boundaries are drawn from historical gauge data. Where the boats get pre-positioned is based on where the water historically went. All of it is reasonable, all of it is professional, and all of it points backwards, because the past is the only data set that exists. For the White River, the number that all of that pointed back to was 1913. Which brings us to the thing I've been holding since the start of this video. The 1913 flood was not a bigger version of this week's flood. It was a different animal. It happened in a different season. It drew on a water source that August does not have and cannot have. By every measure of raw hydrological loading, it should have been out of reach. It had more to work with. And it lost anyway. Once you see what 1913 had that this week did not, the record on that gauge stops being a piece of trivia about a river in Indiana and starts being a question about every number like it in the country. Part 5. The flood that set the record. To understand what just happened to Indiana, you have to go back to the last week of March 1913. On March 23rd, a storm system moved into Indiana carrying heavy rain. On its own, it would have been a significant spring storm and nothing more. But before it could clear the region, a second system arrived, tracking up from Texas, and that second system did something that should sound extremely familiar by now. It stalled. It sat over southern Indiana for more than 2 days and would not move. The rainfall from that combination ran between 6 and 11 inches across Indiana, Ohio, and parts of Pennsylvania and Kentucky. In pure rainfall terms, that is comparable to what fell this week. Slightly less at the top end than Newcastle recorded in the same general range. But 1913 was a spring flood, and a spring flood in the American Midwest is a fundamentally different kind of event from a summer rainfall flood. It is not the same disaster with a different date on it. It is a different hydrological system, and it has advantages that August simply does not possess. Start with what is sitting on the ground. In late March, across the upper Midwest, there is snow. Not necessarily deep snow that late in the season, but snowpack, held in the shaded places and the northern slopes and the field margins, and every inch of that snowpack is water in storage. A snowpack is a reservoir that happens to be lying on the landscape instead of sitting behind a dam. It has already fallen. It is already there. It is simply waiting for a temperature. Warm rain is that temperature. When rain falls on snowpack, two things happen at once. The rain itself runs off, and the snowpack melts and runs off with it. The river receives both, so a 6-inch rainfall on snowpack does not deliver 6 inches to the channel. It delivers 6 inches plus whatever the snowpack was holding, released on the same schedule into the same creeks. Now consider the ground underneath. In late March in Indiana, soil is either still partially frozen or very recently thawed and already waterlogged from the winter. Frozen ground has almost no infiltration capacity at all. Water hitting it behaves closer to water hitting pavement than water hitting soil. It does not soak in. It moves laterally, immediately, toward the nearest low point, and the nearest low point drains to a creek. Then there is the state of the river itself before the storm even starts. Rivers in late March are already running high. Seasonal melt has been feeding them for weeks. The channel is already carrying substantially more than its summer base flow, which means there is less room, less freeboard, less capacity to absorb a surge before the water reaches the top of the bank. Add those together, and you have the 1913 loading. Rain, plus a released snowpack, plus ground that could not absorb, plus a river that was already full before the first drop landed. The 1913 flood was not a local Indiana event either. It was a regional catastrophe that ran across the Ohio Valley and killed hundreds of people, and it remains the reference disaster for that entire part of the country. Whole downtowns went under. Rail lines, which were the transportation backbone of the era, were cut across multiple states at once, which meant that the places that needed help were also the places nobody could reach. Communication went down with the telegraph lines. For several days in the last week of March, a large section of the American Midwest was simultaneously underwater and unreachable. What came out of it was the modern American approach to flood control. The scale of the 1913 disaster was the direct trigger for a generation of engineering, most famously the Conservancy District system in Ohio, which built dry dams and channel improvements specifically sized against what happened that March. That is the pattern worth noticing. A flood happens, the flood becomes a number, and the number becomes concrete, and earth, and regulation. The disaster gets built into the landscape as its own memorial and its own defense. That combination produced the crests that defined Indiana for over a century. 23.6 feet at Anderson, 23.8 feet at Noblesville. Those numbers went into the record, and then they went into everything downstream of the record. And I mean that literally. Once a crest like that exists in the gauge record, it stops being history and becomes infrastructure. It sets the design basis. Engineers use it when they size levees. Planners use it when they draw the boundaries of a floodplain. Insurers use it when they price a policy. Local officials use it when they decide whether a subdivision can be built on a particular parcel. The number leaves the hydrology office and quietly embeds itself in the physical and legal structure of the towns along that river. 1913 was not just a bad flood in Indiana history. It became the definition of the worst case. For 113 years, when anyone along that river asked how bad it could possibly get, the answer they got back was 1913. And that answer had unusual authority because of how long it held. A record that falls every 15 or 20 years does not really function as a ceiling. People treat it as a rough guide, they expect it to move, and they build with some margin above it because they know another one is coming. A record that stands for over a century starts to feel like a physical property of the river rather than a statistical outcome. 3 generations of engineers, planners, and homeowners along that stretch of water lived their entire professional and personal lives without ever seeing it approached. At some point, a number that has never been beaten stops being understood as the highest observed value and starts being understood as the highest possible value. Those are very different things, and the difference is invisible right up until the moment it matters. I want to underline something before we go on, because it would be easy to file this section under interesting historical background and let it slide past. 1913 is not background. 1913 is the benchmark that just failed, and the failure of benchmarks is what this entire video is about. There is one more feature of the 1913 event that makes the comparison sharper rather than softer, and it concerns what the country could do about it at the time. In 1913, there was no national weather warning system in any modern sense. There was no radar, no satellite, no river forecast centre issuing crest predictions days in advance, no way to tell a town 20 miles downstream what was coming toward it. People found out that the water was rising by watching it rise. Whole communities were surprised by a flood that had already destroyed the town upstream because the message could not travel faster than the water. That is the enormous advantage 2026 had, and it is the reason the death tolls of the two events are not remotely comparable. Modern forecasting turned a surprise into a scheduled arrival. It is also why the failure this week is so much more interesting than the failure in 1913. 1913 failed because nobody could see it coming. 2026 had everybody seeing it coming, publishing it, dating it, and being correct, and the record fell anyway. So line it up honestly, because the comparison is the whole point. 1913 had rain. It had a stalled system, exactly like this week. It had 6 to 11 inches. On top of that, it had a snowpack releasing into the same channels. It had ground that could not absorb anything. It had a river already running high before the storm arrived. August 2026 had rain. That is the entire difference. One event brought 4 sources of water, and one brought a single source, and the one with a single source produced the higher crest at 2 separate gauges on the same river. That should not be possible with the assumptions everyone was working from. So either the assumptions are wrong, or something about the rain itself has changed. Let me show you which. Part 6. The missing ingredient. August in Indiana has no snowpack. It is a simple observation and it carries an enormous amount of weight. There is no snow anywhere in the state. There is no frozen ground. There is no seasonal melt running in the channel. The White River in the middle of August is running at or near its lowest annual base flow, in the driest, warmest part of the year, when evaporation is at its peak and vegetation is actively pulling water out of the soil all day long. August is the season when a river is furthest from flooding. Structurally, hydrologically, in every way that can be measured, August is the hard mode. And there is an additional drain on the system in summer that has no March equivalent at all. A mature corn crop across the middle of Indiana in August is a vast biological pump, moving water out of the soil and into the air continuously through every daylight hour, and doing it at rates that dwarf anything happening in a March field of bare dirt and stubble. Add direct evaporation from warm soil and warm water surfaces under a high summer sun, and the watershed in August is actively working against the accumulation of water in a way that a watershed in late March simply is not. Every day, between rainfall events in summer, the basin is drying itself out from the top down. In March, it is doing close to the opposite. So the summer watershed does not merely lack the extra water sources that spring has, it is running a continuous subtraction that spring does not run. The gap between the two seasons is wider than the presence or absence of snow. The 2026 flood had exactly one water source. Rain that fell out of the sky between August 11th and August 13th. Nothing stored, nothing released, nothing already in the channel, just precipitation, landing on a summer watershed at the least favourable time of year for producing a flood. And it beat 1913 at both gauges. Set the two events side by side and the arithmetic is uncomfortable. 1913 delivered 6 to 11 inches of rain, plus a released snowpack contributing an unknown but significant additional depth onto ground with almost no infiltration capacity, into a channel that was already elevated by weeks of seasonal melt. 2026 delivered 11.43 inches at its maximum point onto a summer watershed, into a river running at low base flow, 4 contributing factors against 1, the one won by a foot and 4 inches at Anderson, which means the rain had to be doing far more work per inch than the rain in 1913 did, and there are only a few ways that is possible. The first is intensity. Rain that falls slowly over many hours gives soil time to absorb it, gives ditches time to drain, gives the whole system time to process what it is receiving. Rain that falls at high rates overwhelms the infiltration capacity of the surface immediately, and everything beyond that capacity becomes runoff regardless of how much theoretical room the soil column has underneath. 2 inches over 12 hours and 2 inches over 90 minutes are not the same event. One is a wet afternoon, the other is a flash flood. The second is placement, and placement may matter more than most people realise. Consider 2 scenarios with the same total volume of water. In the first, 11 inches of rain is spread evenly across an entire large river basin. Every creek rises, every tributary rises, and the main stem rises steadily over a long period as all that water arrives from many directions on many different schedules. You get a long, moderate, unpleasant rise. In the second scenario, that same volume is concentrated into a narrow band inside one watershed. Now the water arrives from one place on one schedule, and it stacks, same total, completely different river response. The rain this week fell in a narrow band. That is the geometry that converts rainfall total into peak river stage most efficiently, and it is why Newcastle at 11.43 inches and Greensburg at 7 ended up mattering more than a broader, gentler distribution of the same water ever would have. The gradient across that band is worth thinking about too. Newcastle recorded 11.43 inches. Greensburg, not far away in the same general event, recorded a little over 7. Those 2 towns are close enough that most people would describe them as having had the same storm, and one of them received 60% more rain than the other. That is how sharp the edges of a training corridor can be. If you lived at the wrong end of that gradient, you experienced a serious multi-day rain event and a soggy basement. If you lived at the other end, you experienced a federal disaster. The difference between those 2 experiences was a matter of a few tens of miles, and nothing about it was predictable in advance with any precision. The third factor is the one people get backwards, and it is worth spending a moment on. There is a comfortable assumption that dry summer ground is a buffer, that August soil can absorb a great deal before anything runs off, and that is true right up until it is not. Soil infiltration capacity is not a fixed number. It starts high on dry ground and it collapses as the soil saturates. The first inch soaks in beautifully. The second soaks in more slowly. By the third or fourth, in most soils, you are approaching the point where the surface layer is saturated and additional water simply has nowhere to go. From that point on, saturated summer soil behaves almost identically to frozen March soil. The buffer is real, but it is small and it is spent early, which reframes what the August 11th through 13th sequence actually was. The earlier rounds of storms were not the disaster, they were the preparation for it. They spent the buffer. By the time the heaviest band set up, the ground had already been converted from a summer watershed into something that behaved like a March one, and then the heaviest rain arrived on top of it. So now let me reframe that margin, because 1 foot and 4 inches sounds small and it is not. Moving a river record by any amount is difficult. Records exist because they represent the outer edge of what a system produced across the entire period of observation. Moving the Anderson record required exceeding a crest that had held through 113 years of storms, and doing it in the wrong season with 1/4 of the hydrological loading. That is not a marginal exceedance. That is a different regime producing a higher number than the old regime managed at its worst. Back in the video on August 6th about the pattern change setting up across America, we talked about a warmed baseline and used the loaded dice framing. Loaded dice do not roll numbers that do not exist on the faces. The faces are the same. What changes is how often the high numbers come up. This is what a loaded die looks like when you stop talking about it in the abstract and look at one county in Indiana. The same storms, the same season, the same river, one number that used to be the ceiling. Which puts the entire weight of this story onto the rain itself. If precipitation was the only source, then everything depends on how much water the air sitting over Indiana was capable of carrying and releasing. And that number is not a constant. It never has been. It depends on exactly one thing, and we're going to get to it. But first, the water had to get from the sky to the gauge, and that journey is not the straightforward thing most people assume. Part 7. How a river actually floods. It rained hardest on Wednesday. The river crested on Friday. That gap confuses people, and the confusion is understandable. If the rain is the cause and the flood is the effect, why is there a 2-day delay between them? Rivers do not seem like slow things. Standing next to one during a flood, watching brown water tear past carrying whole trees, slow is not the word that comes to mind. The answer is that a river does not receive rain. A watershed receives rain, and a watershed is enormous. Follow a single raindrop. It lands on a field somewhere in the upper part of the basin. Most of it soaks in, at least at first. What does not soak in moves downhill across the surface slowly at walking pace or less, collecting in the low spots. From there it reaches a ditch, and in the ditch it accelerates. The ditch feeds a small creek. The creek feeds a larger creek. That feeds a tributary, and the tributary eventually reaches the main stem of the White River. Every stage of that journey takes time, and critically the amount of time depends on where in the basin the drop landed. Water that falls near the river reaches it in hours. Water that falls at the far upper edge of the basin, 30 or 40 miles away, might take a day or more to make the same journey. So the river is not receiving all the rain at once. It is receiving it as a long, spread-out arrival, and that arrival curve is what produces a crest rather than a spike. The river rises as the contributions from progressively more distant parts of the basin stack on top of each other, peaks when the arrivals are maximized, and falls as the far edges finish draining. This is why Noblesville matters in a way that goes beyond its own residents. Noblesville sits 15 miles upstream of Indianapolis. Its crest is not just a local event, it is a preview. When that gauge peaks, everyone downstream knows roughly what is coming and roughly when. In flood operations, upstream gauges are the closest thing anyone has to a clock, and they are the reason that evacuation orders can be issued with hours of warning rather than minutes. That clock is also why the whole event took days rather than hours to resolve. Multiple river systems in Indiana were under flood warning at the same time, each with its own basin, its own travel times and its own crest schedule. The White River main stem was the headline, but it was not alone, and a state emergency management operation during a week like this is not managing one flood. It is managing a set of overlapping waves arriving in different counties on different days, with the same finite pool of boats, crews and shelter beds having to be moved between them while each individual crest is still building. There is a detail about gauges themselves that trips people up, and it is worth clearing away. A river stage reading is not the depth of the water. It is a height above an arbitrary local reference point called a datum, chosen decades ago for that specific gauge. 24.93 feet at Anderson does not mean the water was 25 feet deep, and it does not mean anything at all at any other gauge on any other river. Every gauge speaks its own private language, and the only numbers that can be compared are numbers from the same gauge, which is exactly why the comparison to 1913 is legitimate. Same gauge, same datum, same river, 113 years apart. The flooding this week concentrated along the White River from Hamilton County down into the northern Indianapolis suburbs, and the word suburbs is doing important work in that sentence. Development changes how a watershed responds to rain, and it changes it in one direction only. Roofs, driveways, roads, parking lots and compacted lawns are impervious surfaces. Rain that falls on them does not infiltrate at all. It runs off immediately, and modern stormwater systems are specifically engineered to move it to the nearest channel as fast as possible, because the entire design goal of urban drainage is to get water off the streets quickly. The unintended consequence is that suburban development converts a slow, distributed arrival into a fast, concentrated one. Rain that would have taken a day to reach the river through soil now reaches it in 20 minutes through a storm drain. The total volume is unchanged, the timing is compressed, and a compressed arrival produces a higher peak stage for exactly the same amount of water. Channel confinement does something similar. Levees, embankments, bridge approaches and flood walls all work by keeping water inside a defined corridor. That protects the land behind them, which is the point. But water that cannot spread sideways has only one direction left, and that direction is up. Confining a flood makes it deeper and faster where it still is. Every levee is a decision to send the problem somewhere else, usually downstream, usually to people who are not consulted. There is one more piece of this worth understanding because it explains something that sounds like a contradiction. A river gauge measures stage, which is height. It does not measure discharge, which is volume per second. And those two things are related by something called a rating curve, which converts a measured height into an estimated flow. That relationship is not permanent. It shifts as the channel changes shape, as sediment deposits or scours out, as vegetation grows in the floodplain, as development alters where water can spread. Which means it is entirely possible for a river to reach a higher stage today than it did in a past event while carrying a similar or even smaller volume of water, because the channel is not the same channel it was. I am not going to claim that is what happened here, because that requires an analysis nobody has published yet. But it is a real consideration, and it matters because the record that fell was a stage record. 23.6 feet was a height. 24.93 feet is a height. And heights are measured in a channel that has had 113 years to change. Notice what every single one of these mechanisms has in common. Training storms, infiltration collapse, impervious surfaces, channel confinement, travel time. Not one of them is about how much water fell. Every one of them is about how fast the water arrived at a particular point. Rate is the through line of this entire story in Indiana and shortly in Hawaii. And every levee height, every bridge clearance, every floodplain boundary and every culvert diameter along that river was calculated using a statistical method built on the gauge record. That method has an assumption buried in it, and this week that assumption took a direct hit. Part 8. The 100-Year Flood Problem. You have heard the phrase 100-year flood. It is one of the most widely used and most thoroughly misunderstood terms in the whole of natural hazard communication, and the misunderstanding is not the public's fault. The phrase is genuinely misleading. A 100-year flood does not mean a flood that happens once every 100 years. It means a flood with a 1% chance of being equaled or exceeded in any given year, 1 in 100 every year independently, which means 2 of them can happen in consecutive years with no statistical contradiction whatsoever. Work it through because the arithmetic surprises people. If there is a 1% chance each year, then the chance of it happening in 2 consecutive years is 1% of 1%, which is 1 in 10,000. Rare, but across the thousands of gauged river reaches in the United States, guaranteed to happen somewhere every single year. And over the 30-year life of a mortgage, the probability that a property in a so-called 100-year floodplain floods at least once is not 1%. It is about 26%. Roughly 1 in 4, that is the number people should be given when they buy a house, and it is essentially never the number they hear. So where does the 1% come from in the first place? It comes from the gauge record. Someone takes the annual peak stage at a gauge, every year for as long as records exist, and fits a statistical distribution to those numbers. From that fitted distribution you can extract exceedance probabilities. The 1% line becomes the 100-year flood. The 0.2% line becomes the 500-year flood. It is a reasonable, defensible, standard piece of statistical hydrology, and it rests on an assumption called stationarity. Stationarity is the claim that the statistical properties of the system are not changing over time, that the mean and the variance and the shape of the distribution of annual floods are constant, so a record from the past is a fair sample of the future. It is the assumption that lets you take 113 years of history and use it to make a statement about next year. Under stationarity, a record falling is not a problem, records fall. That is what happens when you keep sampling from a distribution, and every time you extend the record you get another chance at the tail. A new maximum is expected eventually, but the manner in which this record fell is the part that deserves attention. It did not fall to a 1913-style event that happened to be slightly worse. It fell to a mechanism that did not set it. A summer rainfall flood, with 1 water source instead of 4, exceeded a spring snowmelt flood at 2 separate gauges on the same river. That is not the same distribution producing a new maximum. That is a different process producing a number the old process never reached at its worst. And a different process producing new maxima is exactly the circumstance where stationarity stops being a safe assumption, which matters enormously because of everything sitting downstream of those statistics. And I want to be concrete about this rather than abstract because the abstraction hides the stakes. Flood insurance rate maps are drawn from these numbers. They determine whether a homeowner is required to carry flood insurance and what they pay for it. Floodplain boundaries drawn from these numbers determine whether a parcel can be developed and what has to be elevated. Levee ratings are certified against these numbers, and that certification determines whether the land behind the levee is officially considered protected. Culvert diameters and bridge clearances are sized against these numbers, which means the physical dimensions of transportation infrastructure across an entire state trace back to a statistical fit. Building codes reference these numbers for required elevation of the lowest floor. Even mortgage lending depends on them, because lenders require flood insurance in mapped zones. All of it, every piece, traces back to a distribution fitted to a historical gauge record, and those documents update slowly. Flood insurance rate map revisions are multi-year processes involving new hydraulic modelling, public comment periods, appeals, and adoption by local governments. The 1930 number governed for 113 years. Nobody currently knows how long it takes 24.93 feet to replace 23.6 feet in the paperwork that actually determines where people are allowed to live. There is a second layer of the terminology problem that makes this worse in practice. Alongside the 100-year flood, there is a 500-year flood, which is the 0.2% annual exceedance line. And in most American communities, that boundary is drawn on the map but carries almost no regulatory weight. It is treated as a curiosity, and yet the difference between the 1% line and the 0.2% line is frequently a matter of a few feet of water depth, which is to say a matter of whether the water reaches your electrical panel. Two households on the same street, one just inside a line and one just outside it, face completely different insurance requirements, completely different building standards, and very nearly identical actual risk. There is also an active field of work on methods that drop the stationarity assumption entirely, using trends in the record rather than assuming there are none. Those methods exist, they are published, and they are argued about vigorously among hydrologists. What they have not done at any scale is replace the regulatory framework, because a regulatory framework has to be defensible in court and consistent across jurisdictions. And a method that produces a different answer every time the record is extended is a difficult thing to write into law. I want to be fair to the engineers here, because there is a lazy version of this argument that blames them, and it is wrong. Engineers are not making an error by designing against historical extremes. Historical extremes are the only data that exists. Nobody has a gauge record from the future. The design basis is a lagging indicator by construction, not by negligence, and the profession has been openly discussing non-stationary methods for years. The problem is not that engineers do not know. The problem is that the entire regulatory and financial apparatus built on top of their work moves at the speed of public comment periods, and rivers do not. So here is where we stand at the halfway point of this story. Indiana's benchmark just failed. The number that defined the worst case for a river running through the middle of a state was exceeded by a weaker flood in the wrong season, and the documents that protect the people along that river still contain the old number. Hold that thought. Because 4,000 miles away, another benchmark was about to be tested the same weekend. That one is 34 years old, and the storm that tested it was the weakest kind of hurricane there is. If a record that governed a river for 113 years can be broken by a lesser flood in the hardest month of the year, then what is the actual worst case? And does anyone know? Part 9. A hurricane, where hurricanes do not go. At some point on Saturday, August 15th, 2026, a tropical storm in the Central Pacific crossed a line. Maximum sustained winds reached 75 miles an hour. That is the threshold. Below it, you are a tropical storm. At it, you are a hurricane, Category 1 on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Lala crossed that line with the big island of Hawaii directly ahead of it, and the National Hurricane Center used the phrase life-threatening in its public messaging before the closest approach. To understand why that mattered so much to people living on that island, you have to understand how rare this is. A direct strike would have been Hawaii's first hurricane landfall in more than 30 years. 30 years. Think about what that means for a place. There are people on the Big Island in their mid-30s who have never in their lives experienced a hurricane landfall in their own state. There are entire careers in emergency management that have started and ended inside that gap. There are homes that have been built, sold, renovated, and sold again, without a single owner ever needing to find out how they perform in hurricane-force wind. So why is Hawaii spared? It sits in the middle of the largest ocean on the planet, in the tropics, in a basin that produces tropical cyclones every year. On the face of it, it should be getting hammered constantly. It is not, and there are several separate reasons, each of which has to fail before a storm gets through. The first one is geometric, and it has nothing to do with weather at all. The Hawaiian Islands are very small, and the Pacific is very large. The main chain spans a few hundred miles in a basin that spans thousands. A tropical cyclone tracking west across that ocean has an enormous amount of open water available to it, and a vanishingly small chance of intersecting a specific rock in the middle. Before you consider a single meteorological factor, the odds of a hit are low simply because of the size of the target. The second reason is the water. Tropical cyclones are heat engines. They run on the temperature difference between a warm ocean surface and the cold upper atmosphere, drawing energy up through evaporation and releasing it as the water vapor condenses into cloud, and that process requires sea surface temperatures above roughly 26 or 27 degrees Celsius through a meaningful depth. In the waters immediately east and north of the Hawaiian Islands, the ocean is often cooler than that. Storms that look formidable 1,000 miles out run into progressively less favourable water in the final stretch of the approach, and the engine starves at exactly the wrong moment for a storm's ambitions and exactly the right moment for the people on the island. The third reason is wind shear. A tropical cyclone is a vertically stacked structure, a column that has to stay aligned from the surface to the top of the troposphere to function. Wind shear is a change in wind speed or direction with height, and it tilts that column, and a tilted cyclone leaks. The heat and moisture it is trying to concentrate at the centre get displaced away instead. The central Pacific frequently carries enough shear to disrupt approaching systems, and it acts like a fence that most storms cannot get over. There is a fourth factor that rarely gets mentioned and probably should. Most tropical systems that reach Hawaiian longitudes did not form there. They formed off the coast of Mexico and Central America, in the eastern Pacific, and then tracked west for thousands of miles before arriving in the Central Pacific Basin. That is an enormously long journey for a heat engine, and along the way a storm passes over progressively cooler water and encounters whatever shear the atmosphere happens to be serving that week. Most of them simply do not survive the trip. By the time the surviving remnant reaches the longitude of the islands, it is frequently a disorganized swirl of moisture rather than a cyclone, and it delivers rain without ever delivering wind. Which, as this weekend demonstrated, is not the reassurance it sounds like. There is an exception built into that, and it is seasonal. Central Pacific hurricane occurrence peaks in late summer, when the ocean surface reaches its warmest point of the year. The fuel supply is at its annual maximum. The odds of a storm surviving the approach are at their best. That window is exactly the window that Lala arrived in, which is not a coincidence. It is climatology doing what climatology does. Back in late July, we covered the storm that intensified faster than almost anything on record, and the argument in that video applies directly here. Warm water is fuel. Warmer water is more fuel, delivered faster, and a tropical system with abundant fuel and low shear will take everything it is given. The mechanism is not exotic. It is a heat engine with a fuel gauge, and the ocean is the tank. Now, the technical point that everything in this act depends on. Lala did not make an official landfall. That is not a footnote. Landfall has a specific meteorological definition, which is the point at which the centre of circulation crosses the coastline, and it matters because the structure of a hurricane is organised around that centre. The strongest sustained winds sit in the eye wall. Storm surge is driven by the wind field pushing water ahead of the centre onto a shore. Where the centre goes determines where the classic hurricane damage goes. Lala's centre stayed offshore. It passed close enough to put hurricane conditions onto land, close enough to warrant every warning that was issued, and it never technically arrived. On a purely structural reading, the Big Island got the outer portion of a weak hurricane rather than the core of one, and I want to be careful not to let that sound like a lucky escape, because the rain bands on the outer edge of a tropical cyclone are not a mild version of the core. They are a different thing entirely, and in terms of pure rainfall they can be the most productive part of the storm. The eye wall carries the wind. The outer bands carry the sustained, saturated, slow-moving moisture that produces the totals. A storm that keeps its centre offshore while dragging its rain bands across a mountain range for many hours is not delivering a reduced version of a landfall. In rainfall terms, it may well be delivering more than a landfall would have, because a landfalling centre moves inland and takes the whole structure with it, while an offshore centre can park the same bands over the same slopes for as long as it likes, which is, more or less, exactly what happened. Notice what has and has not been described so far in this part. I have told you the category, which is a wind measurement. I have told you the sustained wind speed, which is a wind measurement. I have told you about landfall, which determines where the wind and surge concentrate. Every single number attached to this storm's classification describes air moving horizontally. None of it describes what actually did the damage on the Big Island this weekend, because a storm that never officially arrived, carrying the weakest hurricane classification that exists, took 2 houses off their foundations in a community called Nalahu. understanding how requires setting the wind aside entirely and looking at the one variable nobody puts in the headline. Part 10. 3 to 5 inches an hour. In the heaviest bands, rain was falling on the Big Island at 3 to 5 inches per hour. Sit with that rate for a moment, because it is the most important number in the Hawaii half of this story, and it is almost never the number that gets reported. 5 inches an hour means an inch of rain every 12 minutes. It means that in the time it takes to make a phone call, boil a kettle, or walk to your car and back, the equivalent of a heavy day's rainfall in most of the world has landed on your roof. The daily totals followed from that. One day rain totals surpassed 2 feet in some locations. 24 inches of rain in a single day in one place. And the forecast was still climbing while it happened. After the first bands came through, forecasters expected an additional 4 to 8 inches across the Big Island and windward Maui, with maximum storm totals revised upward into the range of 30 to 35 inches. That revision matters because earlier guidance had called for 10 to 20 inches with maxima around 25. The number went up during the event, which is what happens when a system slows down more than the models expected. So how does a Category 1 produce that? The answer is that the island itself is doing most of the work. The Big Island is not a flat piece of land sitting in the ocean. It is the exposed upper portion of enormous volcanic mountains, and the terrain rises steeply and rapidly from the coastline. When moist air is driven against that terrain, it has nowhere to go but up. This is called orographic lift, and it is the single most efficient rainfall-producing mechanism on the planet. Here is why. Air cools as it rises, because it expands as pressure drops with altitude. Cooler air can hold less water vapor. So air forced up a mountainside is being continuously squeezed, in the sense that its capacity to carry water is being reduced by the ascent itself, and everything it can no longer carry has to come out as rain. It is a ringing action, and the steeper and faster the ascent, the more efficiently it rings. Now feed that mechanism a tropical cyclone. A hurricane is a machine for delivering saturated maritime air in enormous quantity. Aim it at a mountain range that rises thousands of feet within a few miles of the shore, and the rainfall rates you get are far beyond anything the same storm would produce over flat ground or open ocean. The storm supplies the moisture. The island converts it into rain rate. That is why the Big Island can take an ordinary tropical system and turn it into a flash flood emergency. And a flash flood emergency is exactly what was issued for the Cow District on Saturday night. It is worth being clear about what that product is, because the terminology sounds like more of the same and it is not. A flood watch means conditions are favourable. A flood warning means flooding is expected or occurring. A flash flood emergency is the top of the scale, reserved for situations where catastrophic damage and a severe threat to human life are already happening. It is not a forecast product. It is an observation product. When it goes out, someone has already reported something terrible, and there is a specific reason that product gets used on the Big Island in situations where a comparable rainfall on flat ground would not warrant it. The same steep terrain that wrings the rain out of the air also delivers it downhill immediately. A watershed on a volcanic slope is short, steep and fast. There is no long, slow, overland journey of the kind we walked through in Indiana, where water took 2 days to reach a gauge. Here the distance from ridge to shoreline can be a handful of miles, dropping thousands of feet along the way, which means rain that falls on the upper slopes arrives in the stream channels at the bottom within minutes. The result is a stream that is not a stream, and then, very suddenly, is. A gully that has been dry or nearly dry all summer can go from nothing to a wall of moving water carrying rock, soil and vegetation in the time it takes for a heavy band to pass over the ground above it. That is not a flood in the sense that Indiana experienced a flood. There is no slow rise, no crest forecast, no upstream gauge acting as a clock. There is a channel, and then there is a torrent in it, and anything built near that channel finds out at the same moment everyone else does. In Nalehu, 2 homes were swept away. Hawaii County Mayor Kimo Alameda said publicly that several occupied homes may have been swept off their foundations amid flash flooding in the Alihu and Waiheno areas, with a search and rescue mission underway. I want to read that statement carefully with you, because the wording is doing a lot of precise work. He said several occupied homes. Occupied means people were understood to be inside. He said may have been swept off their foundations, which is a statement of uncertainty, not caution for its own sake, but genuine uncertainty. because during a flash flood emergency at night nobody can safely go and look, and he said a search and rescue mission was underway, which is the operational consequence of that uncertainty. Officials did not know. That is what the statement actually says, and it was the honest thing to say. Hawaii County Civil Defense initiated a joint search and rescue operation, drawing on county resources, the Hawaii National Guard, and the United States Coast Guard. 3 separate organizations coordinated overnight on an island during an active flash flood emergency. And 1 person died in Hawaii this weekend, in a storm-related vehicle crash. Notice that. 4,000 miles from Indiana, in a completely different disaster, driven by a completely different weather system, in a tropical marine climate on volcanic terrain, and the single confirmed death is a vehicle in a storm. The exact failure mode we walked through earlier in this video. The physics of a car and moving water do not care which ocean the water came from. So let me state the thing this part has been building toward, as directly as I can. A Category 1 hurricane, the weakest classification that exists, which never officially made landfall, removed occupied houses from their foundations on the Big Island of Hawaii. It did not do it with wind. It did not do it with storm surge at a landfall point, because there was no landfall point. It did it with rainfall rate against terrain, and the classification system we use to communicate hurricane danger to the public has no field for that at all. Which is the same failure the Indiana story had, in a mirror image. There, the warning product was severe thunderstorm, one of the most routine warnings in the country, and the thing that killed people was the fact that those routine storms would not move. Here, the warning product was Category 1, the mildest hurricane rating there is, and the thing that killed was 5 inches of rain an hour on a mountainside. In both cases, the public-facing number described something real, and described entirely the wrong thing. Water arriving faster than the ground can take it. That's the whole story in 2 climates, in 1 week. And the water was only the first problem the Big Island had that night. The second one arrived when the lights went out. Part 11. The Islands Go Dark. Earlier on Saturday, Hawaiian Electric was reporting more than 40,000 customers without power. By Saturday evening, that figure had passed 88,000. The number roughly doubled inside a single afternoon, and I want to draw attention to when that happened, because the timing tells you something. Lala was already weakening. The storm was being downgraded back to a tropical storm and moving away, and the damage curve was still climbing steeply while the meteorological threat was declining. That is a pattern worth remembering, because it is the reason so many people get hurt after a storm rather than during it. The weather peaks first. The consequences peak later. The breakdown across the chain was roughly 63,270 customers on Hawaii Island, 15,260 in Maui County, and 9,500 on Oahu. So this was not confined to the island the storm passed. 3 separate islands lost power from a system whose centre stayed offshore of one of them. On the Hamakua coast, on the northeastern side of the Big Island, crews were assessing a 42-mile span of transmission lines after fallen trees knocked down multiple poles and structures. 42 miles. That is the detail I would flag above all others in the Hawaii story, and it is worth explaining why a length of damaged line is more alarming than a headline outage count. Electrical networks are built in layers. At the bottom is distribution, the poles and wires running down residential streets, feeding individual homes. Above that is transmission, the high-voltage backbone that carries bulk power from generation to the distribution network. Distribution damage is common, annoying, and comparatively quick to fix because it is scattered and each repair restores a small number of customers. Transmission damage is a different category of problem entirely. It is the trunk rather than the branches, and until the trunk is back, restoring branches accomplishes nothing. There is a further wrinkle specific to islands. On a large interconnected mainland grid, generation is spread across many plants feeding a shared network. So losing a transmission path is usually a routing problem rather than a supply problem. On an isolated island system, generation is concentrated at a small number of sites, and the transmission backbone is what connects those sites to everyone else. Sever a long enough section of that backbone, and it does not matter how much generating capacity is sitting intact on the other end of it. The power exists. It simply has no path. A 42-mile transmission corridor with multiple poles and structures down is not a scattered outage pattern. It is a linear failure along an entire coast, which suggests that whatever came through hit the corridor along its length rather than at a point. And every one of those structures has to be reached, assessed, and rebuilt on terrain that is steep, wet, and in many places accessible only by a single road that may itself be damaged. Now add the constraint that makes Hawaii genuinely different from anywhere on the mainland. Hawaii's islands are not grid interconnected, not with each other, and not with any continental network. Each island runs its own isolated electrical system, generating its own power, balancing its own load, with no ability to import a single watt from a neighbour when something goes wrong. The consequence of that reaches much further than most people realise, and it is not really about electricity at all. It is about trucks. When a hurricane hits the American southeast, the restoration effort that follows is one of the more impressive logistical operations in the country. Utilities across multiple states send crews under mutual aid agreements. Convoys of bucket trucks stage in advance, sometimes hundreds of miles out, and roll in behind the storm as soon as the wind drops below the threshold at which a bucket can be safely raised. Thousands of additional workers can be on the ground within a day. None of that's available on an island. There is no road to Hawaii. Every additional crew, every replacement pole, every transformer, every bucket truck either was already on that island before the storm or arrives by ship or by aircraft, on a schedule measured in days rather than hours, into ports and airports that are themselves recovering from the same storm. So Hawaiian Electric's warning of possible extended outages, potentially overnight, and its message that customers on Hawaii Island and Maui should expect to remain without power at minimum through the night, was not a hedge. It was a straightforward description of a physical constraint. It is also worth saying plainly what an extended outage actually does to a household, because the phrase gets used so often that it has stopped carrying weight. Losing power for a night is an inconvenience. Losing power for several days in a hot, humid climate is something else. Refrigerated food is gone within roughly a day. Anyone who depends on a home medical device that plugs into a wall is now dependent on a generator, a car battery, or a hospital. In many rural areas of the Big Island, household water comes from a catchment system with an electric pump, which means no power is also no water, no shower, and no working toilet. Some of those same households are on septic rather than sewer, and a saturated field in a flood does not process anything regardless of whether the pump runs. Layer that onto a community that has just had a flash flood emergency, where roads may be cut and the nearest store may be closed because it also has no power, and the picture is not people sitting in the dark waiting for a switch. It is a set of compounding failures where each one makes the others harder to solve. There is also a sequencing rule in utility work that cannot be shortcut, and it frustrates people every single time. Crews cannot assess in unsafe conditions. Repairs cannot begin until assessment is complete. Assessment cannot be completed until the weather allows access. So the clock on restoration does not start when the outage starts. It starts when the storm decides to let go, and every hour the storm lingers is an hour added to the front of a process that has not yet begun. And notice what actually brought the lines down. Fallen trees. The same mechanism we walked through in Indiana, where days of rain turned the soil around root plates into slurry, and ordinary wind laid trees over onto whatever was underneath. In Indiana, what was underneath was a house with a 4-year-old boy in it. In Hawaii, what was underneath was the transmission backbone of an island. The same physics, in a tropical forest and in a Midwestern suburb, in the same week, producing a fatality in one place and a blackout in the other. The wind category never described any of this either. What took the grid down on the Hamakua coast was not 75-mile-an-hour gusts acting on healthy soil. It was days of water in the ground. And the last time an island in this chain took a direct hurricane hit, almost nobody currently living on the Big Island was there to see it happen. Part 12, Iniki and the 34-year gap. On September 11th, 1992, Hurricane Iniki made landfall on the island of Kauai as a Category 4. It remains the most powerful hurricane to strike Hawaii in recorded history, and the only known major hurricane to hit the state. It caused approximately $3.1 billion in 1992 dollars, and it killed 7 people. Before Iniki, there was Hurricane Iwa in 1982, a decade earlier. Those two events are essentially the entire modern experience of hurricanes in Hawaii. 2 storms, 10 years apart, and then 34 years of nothing. The ocean conditions when Iniki formed are worth noting, because they line up with everything we have covered about the fuel supply for tropical systems. Sea surface temperatures were running 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal at the time, and the Central Pacific overall was substantially warmer than usual. Warm water was considered a positive contributing factor in Iniki's development, which is exactly what the heat engine model predicts. Iniki also reshaped things that had nothing to do with weather. The rebuilding on Kauai ran for years, and the storm rewrote the insurance market for the entire state, because a single event of that magnitude in a place with no hurricane history forced every carrier to reprice a risk they had previously treated as close to theoretical. The event became a permanent line in every actuarial table covering the islands. That is another version of the same pattern we have been tracing all the way through this video. A disaster happens, the disaster becomes a number, and the number quietly embeds itself in the financial and regulatory structure of the place it happened to, where it then sits, unchallenged, for as long as nothing exceeds it. But the number I want to focus on is not the category or the cost. It is 34 years. 34 years is longer than a career. It is longer than a mortgage. It is longer than most people have lived on the Big Island, given how much of the population arrived within the last few decades. And institutional memory does not survive a gap that long on its own. It only survives if somebody deliberately keeps it alive, and deliberate effort competes for budget with every other priority a county has. What decays across a gap like that is more specific and more mundane than most people imagine. Personal preparedness decays, obviously. Households that once kept water, batteries, and a plan let all 3 lapse because nothing has ever happened. But the institutional decay is the part that costs more. Vegetation management near power lines is the clearest example. Tree trimming programs are expensive, unglamorous, and continuously vulnerable to budget pressure, and their entire value is invisible right up until a storm arrives. Every year without a hurricane is a year in which cutting the trimming budget appears to have had no consequences whatsoever. That is a very difficult argument to win in a council meeting, and it is one of the reasons a 42-mile transmission corridor can end up under trees that have had a long time to grow. Generator maintenance follows the same curve. Emergency supply pre-positioning follows it. Backup communications follow it. Drills and exercises follow it, because staff turn over and the people who ran the last real event retire. Everything that only pays off during a rare event decays between rare events, and the longer the gap, the further the decay progresses. Building stock decays in a subtler way, and it is not that the buildings get worse, it is that they get built. 34 years of construction on an island that has not experienced a hurricane produces a lot of structures whose owners have never had a reason to think about wind uplift on a roof, or about what a stream channel does in a 2-foot rainfall, or about how far from a gully is far enough. The older buildings were put up by people with recent memory, the newer ones were not. And in a place where the population has grown substantially across that same window, the newer ones are a large share of the total. None of that is a criticism of anyone. It is a description of what happens to any community anywhere when a threat is real but infrequent. Human institutions are extremely good at maintaining readiness for things that happen every year. They're extremely bad at maintaining readiness for things that happen every 30. So connect this back to where the whole video has been going, because Iniki is Hawaii's 1913. That is the parallel, and it is exact. A single old catastrophic event that becomes the definition of the worst case. Every subsequent preparation measured against it. Every conversation about how bad it could get answering with the same name. Indiana had a river crest from 1913. Hawaii had a Category 4 landfall from 1992. Both were real. Both were terrible. Both became the ceiling in the public imagination. And this weekend, both of those ceilings turned out to be describing the wrong thing. Indiana prepared for a 1913 scale spring flood and got a summer rainfall flood that exceeded it. Hawaii prepared for an Iniki scale Category 4 landfall and got a Category 1 that never landed and still took houses off their foundations in the Cow District. In both cases, the benchmark was not too small. That is the subtlety I do not want to lose. A Category 4 landfall on the Big Island would be immeasurably worse than what happened this weekend. Nobody was wrong to plan for it. The benchmark was pointed at the wrong variable. It described the intensity of the storm, when the thing that arrived and did the damage was the rate at which water came out of it. So we have two benchmarks, one 113 years old, one 34, both tested in the same week, by events that looked nothing like the events that set them. Which leaves the obvious question, and it is the question the rest of this video exists to answer. If both of those benchmarks missed the same variable, what is the variable? Part 13. The stall is the story. Here is the most alarming sentence in this entire video, and it does not sound alarming at all. Neither of these was an extraordinary storm. I want that to land properly, because the instinct when you hear about a disaster is to assume something exceptional happened, something record-breaking, something the atmosphere had never produced before, something that will be studied for decades as a freak event. That is the comfortable version, because a freak event is by definition rare, and rare means it is unlikely to happen to you. That is not what this was. Lala was a Category 1. In the classification system used for hurricanes, that is the bottom rung. It is the entry level. Roughly speaking, most tropical cyclones that reach hurricane strength anywhere on Earth spend at least some portion of their lives at Category 1, and a great many never get past it. There is nothing remarkable about a Category 1 hurricane except its existence. And the Indiana event was thunderstorms. Thunderstorms in August in the Midwest along a front. The severe thunderstorm warning is one of the most frequently issued products in the entire National Weather Service catalogue. Millions of Americans receive one every summer and think nothing of it correctly, because almost every time nothing much comes of it. Two entirely ordinary weather phenomena, 7 dead across 2 states, a 113-year-old record broken, a federal emergency declaration, tens of thousands without power on 3 islands, and the only variable that separates that outcome from an ordinary week is duration. So let me rebuild the Indiana stall properly, as a mechanism, because understanding why a front stops is understanding the whole event. Fronts move because something pushes them. The upper level flow, the belt of fast-moving air several miles up that we call the jet stream, provides both the steering and the energy for surface weather systems. When the jet is strong and progressive, running roughly west to east in a relatively straight line, surface systems move along briskly underneath it. Weather arrives, weather leaves, everything stays on schedule. When the upper flow becomes slack, or when it buckles into a pattern where the ridges and troughs are locked in position, the surface systems underneath lose their steering. A front in that situation does not disappear. It simply stops making progress, and it becomes a stationary front, which is exactly the term forecasters use. In this case, the boundary was caught between 2 air masses that were each unwilling to give ground. To the south, warm and extremely humid air was being drawn northward. To the north, a cooler, drier air mass was holding position. Neither was able to displace the other, so the boundary between them settled into place across the Midwest and stayed there. A stationary boundary on its own is not a disaster. It is a line on a map where 2 air masses meet, and if nothing is being delivered to it, nothing much happens. The Indiana event needed the second ingredient, and that ingredient was supply. High pressure over the Gulf was doing the supplying. Circulation around a high in the northern hemisphere runs clockwise, so the western side of a Gulf high pushes air northward, and air that has spent time over warm subtropical water is carrying an enormous amount of water vapor. That flow ran continuously for days, aimed directly at a boundary that could not move out of its way. Conveyor belt is the standard metaphor, and it earns its place, because the essential feature of a conveyor belt is that it does not stop after one delivery. The third ingredient was the trigger, repeated. Every disturbance riding along the jet stream, each one a comparatively small ripple in the upper flow, provided the lift needed to fire a new round of convection when it reached the boundary. So the event was never one storm complex sitting still. It was a series. Storms formed, matured, rained themselves out, collapsed, and were replaced by the next round behind them, over and over on the same line. And then the geometry. The cells did not run along the boundary, which would have spread the rainfall out across a long corridor. They crossed it, moving roughly perpendicular to it, along nearly identical tracks. Picture a road crossing a railway line, and picture every car in a very long train passing over that same crossing. Each car takes seconds. Each car is separate, but if you are standing at the crossing, you're not there for seconds. You are there until the last car has gone by. That is training, and that is what a narrow band of Indiana counties experienced for 2 days. Now look at the Hawaii event with the same lens, because the mechanism rhymes even though nothing else about it does. Lala's damage came from slow forward motion combined with orographic lift. The storm did not need to be strong. It needed to keep its rain bands over the same slopes, and the slopes did the rest. Functionally, the Big Island had its own stall, a rainfall source that would not move off a fixed piece of terrain. There is a physical limit sitting underneath both of these that deserves to be stated on its own, because it is the reason duration matters so much more than most people assume. Every surface has a maximum infiltration rate. Soil, grass, forest floor, volcanic ash, it does not matter. There is a maximum speed at which water can move down through it, and that speed is a property of the material. The total capacity underneath may be large. The rate of entry is what limits everything. Once rainfall exceeds the infiltration rate, every additional drop becomes runoff immediately, regardless of how much theoretical room exists below. Which means the ground does not care how much rain is coming, it cares how fast. A watershed can absorb an enormous amount of water delivered slowly, and almost none of the same amount delivered quickly. That is why forward speed is arguably the most underrated variable in flood forecasting. Meteorologists can tell you with reasonable confidence how much moisture is available in an air mass, because that can be measured. They can tell you with reasonable confidence where a boundary will set up. What is genuinely hard is predicting exactly how long a system will linger, because that depends on the interaction of large-scale flow, local terrain, and the storm's own self-reinforcing behaviour, and small errors in that estimate produce enormous errors in rainfall totals. Forecast a system moving through in 8 hours and you get a wet day. Forecast it correctly at 8 hours and it actually takes 20, and the same atmosphere produces a federal disaster. Nothing about the moisture changed. The clock changed. This is also why rainfall forecasts carry such enormous spread compared to temperature or wind forecasts, and why a forecaster will tell you 3 inches with isolated higher amounts rather than giving you a single number. The isolated higher amounts phrase is not vagueness. It is an honest admission that the difference between 3 inches and 11 is a matter of whether the cells line up over one particular county, and that alignment is decided by processes operating at scales smaller than the models can resolve. The forecaster knows a training event is possible. Where it sets up is frequently a matter of hours of lead time at best, so the storms did not have to be strong. They had to be slow, and slow is what killed people in 2 states this week. But slow only explains the delivery. It explains how the water got out of the air and onto the ground so efficiently. It does not explain the supply. It does not explain how much water was up there to be delivered in the first place, and the supply runs on a number. Part 14, 7%. For every 1 degree Celsius that air warms, it can hold roughly 7% more water vapour. That is the number. 7% per degree. It is not a projection, it is not a model output, and it is not a matter of opinion. It is a consequence of thermodynamics that was worked out in the 19th century, long before anybody was arguing about climate, by 2 physicists whose names are attached to it. It is called the Clausius-Clapeyron relation, and it describes how the equilibrium vapor pressure of a substance changes with temperature. Let me explain what is actually happening, because the physics is intuitive once you stop treating it as an equation. Above any body of water there is a constant 2-way traffic. Water molecules at the surface with enough energy escape into the air. Water molecules in the air lose energy and get captured back into the liquid. When those 2 rates are equal, the air is holding as much vapour as it can at that temperature, which is what saturation means. Now warm everything up. Molecules move faster, more of them have enough energy to escape, and fewer of the ones already in the air are slow enough to be recaptured. The balance point shifts, and it shifts toward more vapour in the air. That is the whole mechanism. The important detail is that it does not shift in a straight line. The relationship is exponential, which means each additional degree of warming adds more absolute moisture capacity than the degree before it did. 7% of a larger number is a larger number. The effect compounds. Now connect that to rainfall, because holding vapour is not the same as producing a flood. The intensity of extreme precipitation is roughly proportional to the amount of moisture available in the atmospheric column feeding the storm. A storm cannot rain out water that is not there. Give it more and the heaviest rainfall rates it can produce go up in roughly the same proportion in the absence of any other limiting factor, which means extreme rainfall intensity scales at approximately that same 7% per degree. Research also indicates something further, and it is more consequential than the headline number. The entire curve describing the relationship between extreme precipitation and temperature appears to be shifting, because the threshold temperature at which rainfall intensity peaks rises as the baseline temperature rises. It is not simply that the same curve is being climbed further, the curve itself is moving. And this shows up in the observational record, not only in models. Observed trends and climate model output both indicate short duration, extreme rainfall, intensifying at approximately the theoretical rate. Short duration is the operative phrase for us, because a training storm event over Indiana is measured in hours, and that is precisely the timescale where this signal is clearest. There is a reason the short duration signal is the cleanest one, and it is worth a moment because it explains why the effect shows up in floods before it shows up almost anywhere else. Total annual rainfall in a region is governed by a great many things, including circulation patterns, the position of storm tracks, and how often systems come through at all. Those factors can push a region wetter or drier for reasons that have nothing to do with moisture capacity, and they can easily mask a 7% signal underneath a lot of noise. Peak hourly rainfall inside a single storm is a much more direct measurement. It is essentially asking how much water the atmosphere could deliver at maximum effort, in one place, at one time, and that is exactly the quantity the thermodynamics constrains, which is why the number matters far more for flash flooding than for anything else on the hazard list. A region can get less rain overall and still get more destructive rain, because the two are measuring different things. Fewer heavier events is a perfectly coherent outcome, and it is a worse one, because infrastructure is sized against peaks, not averages. A culvert does not care what the annual total is, it cares about the worst hour. Now I am going to spend real time on the caveats, and I want to be clear that this is not throat clearing. If you take the 7% figure away from this video, without the qualifications, you have taken away something misleading, and this channel is not in the business of trading accuracy for a cleaner sentence. The first caveat is that 7% is a global average scaling relationship. It is not a local guarantee, and it should never be applied to a specific county as though it were a promise. Substantial spatial and seasonal deviations from strict Clausius-Clapeyron scaling have been documented across many parts of the world. Some regions scale higher, some scale lower, some show different behavior in different seasons. The second caveat is more technical and more interesting. Studies using convection permitting models, which are models with fine enough resolution to simulate individual storm updrafts rather than approximating them, show hourly rainfall extremes scaling above or below the theoretical rate depending on local dynamics and on whether moisture is actually available to be drawn on. The theory describes a capacity. Whether that capacity is used depends on the storm. The third caveat is the most important one, and it is the one I want you to hold on to above everything else in this part. This relationship is not an attribution statement. Nothing about Clausius-Clapeyron says that the Indiana flood was caused by anything, or that Hurricane Lala was caused by anything. It does not assign blame to a specific storm, and it cannot. What it describes is the size and shape of the container that all weather now operates inside. It tells you about the envelope, not about the reason any individual system formed, tracked where it tracked, or stalled where it stalled. Back on August 6th, when we covered the pattern change setting up across the country, we used the loaded dice framing, and it is worth returning to now because it is the most honest way to hold this. Loading a die does not create new faces. The die still has the same numbers on it. Every individual roll is still random, and every individual roll still has a perfectly ordinary explanation. What changes is the distribution across many rolls. You cannot point at one roll and say the loading caused it. You can look at the pattern and notice that the high numbers are arriving more often than the old distribution said they should. So here is the honest version of the connection between two storms that have no connection. There is no shared cause. There is no mechanism linking a stalled front over the Midwest to a tropical cyclone in the Central Pacific, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What they share is an envelope. Both of them were operating inside the same atmosphere, with the same temperature-dependent ceiling on how much water it can carry, and both of them ran into benchmarks that were established underneath a version of that ceiling that no longer applies. That is a narrower claim than the internet usually makes about weeks like this one. It is also a much more defensible one, and I would rather give you something narrow and true than something sweeping and shaky. Which brings us to the point where a large number of people stop accepting the physics entirely and start proposing something else. Part 15. What people are saying and what the numbers show. 2 federal-scale disasters in 1 week does feel like design. I want to start by taking that seriously rather than sneering at it, because the instinct behind it is not stupid. Human beings are pattern detection machines. That is not a bug. It is one of the most useful things about us, and noticing that 2 enormous things happened at once is exactly the kind of thing a functioning brain is supposed to notice. The question is what you do with the noticing. So let us go through what people are actually saying, one at a time. The first claim is that 2 simultaneous disasters cannot be coincidence, and that something must have arranged them. The response to that is arithmetic, and it is unglamorous. The United States and its territories cover more than 3.5 million square miles, spread across 2 ocean basins and multiple distinct climate zones. August is simultaneously the peak of Central Pacific hurricane season and a peak period for Midwest convective weather. So you have a very large area, running 2 independent disaster-generating seasons at their maximum intensity at the same time. Overlapping events during that window are not the anomaly. They are the statistical expectation. The genuinely surprising thing would be an August with nothing happening anywhere, and the 2 systems share nothing. One is a tropical cyclone that organised over warm Pacific water and tracked west. The other is a mid-latitude frontal boundary that got caught between a Gulf high and a cooler air mass to the north. Different formation mechanism, different energy source, different steering, different hemisphere of the country. There is no plausible way to connect them because there is nothing to connect. The second claim is cloud seeding, and here I want to grant more than most debunkings do, because cloud seeding is real. It is an operational technology. It has been deployed for decades. It is used commercially in a number of countries, and dismissing it as fantasy is simply incorrect. What matters is its limits, and they are severe. Seeding works by introducing particles that give supercooled water droplets something to freeze onto, which encourages precipitation from clouds that are already precipitating, or on the edge of it. It requires supercooled liquid water to be present. It cannot create a cloud, and measured effects on rainfall in favourable conditions generally run from a few % up to, at most, low double-digit percentages. So what seeding cannot do is stall a synoptic scale frontal boundary across 4 states for 3 days. It cannot generate a moisture conveyor from the Gulf. It cannot strengthen a hurricane, and it certainly cannot steer one. The technology operates on individual clouds. The events we are discussing operate on continents. The third claim is ionospheric heating, usually invoked by name as HAARP, and this one has an objection that ends the discussion before you even reach the energy question. Altitude. Ionospheric research facilities deposit energy into the ionosphere. That layer sits roughly 50 to 600 miles above the surface. Weather, all of it, every cloud and every front and every hurricane that has ever existed, happens in the troposphere, which is generally below about 10 miles. Those are not adjacent systems with a debatable interaction. They are separated by an enormous volume of extremely thin atmosphere with no mechanism connecting one to the other. And then there is the argument that closes all 3 of these at once, which is energy accounting. A mature tropical cyclone releases energy on the order of 10 to the 19th joules per day through the latent heat released when water vapour condenses. That is a 10 with 19 zeros after it. It is a figure that exceeds total global electrical generation by orders of magnitude. There is no transmitter, no facility, no aircraft fleet, and no combination of them that delivers energy anywhere near that scale. The same objection kills the Indiana version of the claim, because moving that much moisture from the Gulf to the Ohio Valley over multiple days is a planetary scale transport problem, not something a machine switches on. The fourth claim is that somebody knew and did not warn anyone. This one runs completely backwards, and the public record proves it. The National Weather Service office in Indianapolis upgraded the White River forecast at Muncie and at Anderson. from moderate to major severity days before the crest. The flood warnings carried expiration times running out to August 17th, which is a written, published statement that the crest had not yet arrived. The National Hurricane Center used the phrase life-threatening ahead of Lala's closest approach. Hawaiian Electric warned customers about extended outages before the power went out. Every one of those is a public product with a timestamp on it. The forecast was not the failure point. It was, frankly, very good. The fifth claim is that the death toll is being suppressed, a count that moves from 5 to 6 inside roughly a day, while people are still reported missing and while water is still receding, is not a cover-up. It is what a live count looks like. During the peak, responders are conducting rescues, not searches, and a search only becomes possible when the water is low enough to enter the places the water was. I will say again, clearly, that this number may still move. Now here is what I think the conspiracy framing gets genuinely right, and I do not say that often. It correctly senses that something systematic is going on. It is not wrong about that. Two unrelated storms should not both find the outer edge of what their regions have on record in the same week, and treating each one as an isolated accident does miss something real. The error is not in noticing the pattern. The error is in where the pattern gets located. It gets located in a machine, because a machine is satisfying. A machine has an operator, and an operator can be identified, blamed, and in principle stopped. The actual answer is far less satisfying and far harder to do anything about, because the actual answer is a set of design numbers in engineering documents and a thermodynamic relationship from the 1800s. Nobody's running this. That is the uncomfortable part. Nobody's running it, and the benchmarks are still wrong. Part 16. What happens next? As of this recording, Lala has weakened to a tropical storm and is continuing to the northwest, away from the main island chain. That does not mean it is finished. Rain was still falling behind it, and the upper end of that 30 to 35-inch maximum storm total was still in play for parts of the Big Island. Rainfall totals on the high end of a forecast range are exactly the ones that produce the incidents nobody sees coming, because they arrive on ground that is already saturated from everything that came before them. The Hamakua coast is the number I would watch most closely. 42 miles of transmission line under assessment, on an island with no external mutual aid, is the single most uncertain figure in the Hawaii half of this story. Crews cannot begin until it is safe. Materials cannot be flown or shipped in faster than the ports and airports can handle them, and every household on that circuit is doing arithmetic on their refrigerator, their water pump, and in some cases their medical equipment, while they wait. The search and rescue mission in the Alihu and Waiheno areas is unresolved as I record this. The joint operation involving Hawaii County Civil Defense, the Hawaii National Guard and the Coast Guard was still working. The mayor's statement was that several occupied homes may have been swept off their foundations. That word may is still doing its work, and until that operation concludes, nobody knows what the final number in Hawaii is. In Indiana, the first open question is whether the emergency declaration gets upgraded to a major disaster declaration. That is not a bureaucratic distinction, and I want to make sure it lands as a human one. Under the emergency declaration currently in place, federal money can support the response. It can help pay for the boats, the shelters, the overtime, the emergency operations center. What it cannot do is put anything into the hands of a family whose ground floor has 3 feet of river in it, and whose insurance policy, if they have one, may not cover flood at all. A major disaster declaration changes that. It opens individual assistance, which can mean grants toward temporary housing, toward essential repairs, toward the replacement of belongings that are simply gone. It opens low-interest disaster loans. It opens public assistance, which is the money that rebuilds roads and bridges and water treatment plants and the public buildings that a community actually runs on. Whether Indiana gets there depends on the joint preliminary damage assessments now beginning county by county, and those assessments cannot be completed until the water leaves the places that were hit hardest. So the measurement of the disaster is delayed by the disaster, and the help that depends on the measurement is delayed behind that. The second open question is whether the toll of 6 holds while people are still reported missing. And the third question is the slowest, the least dramatic, and by a considerable margin the most consequential. 24.93 feet exists right now as a number on a gauge at Anderson, Indiana. It is a measurement, sitting in a database. The question is whether it becomes a number on a map, because that is the transition that matters, until a crest like that works its way into flood insurance rate maps, into floodplain boundaries, into levee certifications, into culvert specifications and building elevation requirements. It protects nobody. It is a historical curiosity. 23.6 feet was the number that governed that river for 113 years, and it governed it not because it was correct, but because it was written down in the places that have legal force. Those documents update on cycles measured in years. Hydraulic modelling has to be redone, public comment has to be taken, appeals have to be heard, local governments have to adopt the revisions. Meanwhile, people continue to buy, build, insure and live according to the old lines, because the old lines are the only lines that exist. There is a version of this that plays out in every community after every record flood, and it is worth naming because it is genuinely difficult rather than simply negligent. Redrawing a floodplain boundary outward is not a neutral technical act. It changes what properties are worth. It changes who is required to buy insurance and what they pay. It changes what can be built and what has to be elevated at significant expense. Every one of those consequences lands on real people who did nothing wrong and who bought a house on the basis of a map that the government drew. So the pressure to move slowly is not a conspiracy either. It is the entirely predictable result of a system where the cost of updating a number is immediate, concentrated, and paid by identifiable homeowners, while the benefit of updating it is delayed, diffuse, and only visible during an event that may not happen for years. That asymmetry is the actual obstacle, not secrecy, not incompetence, just an incentive structure that quietly favours the old number every single time. Now step back, because this is not really about one river in Indiana. Every gauged river in this country has a record on it, thousands of them, and every one of those records is doing the same job that 23.6 feet was doing on the White River, which is defining a worst case that the infrastructure around it was engineered against. Every levee height, every bridge clearance, every floodplain boundary, every culvert diameter traces back to a number somebody wrote down after the worst thing they had ever seen. And step back further still. Those numbers were not set independently of each other. Every one of them was set underneath the same atmosphere, with the same temperature-dependent ceiling on how much water the air can carry. That ceiling is not a constant and has never been a constant, and every flood record on this planet was established under a particular version of it. That is the scale this story actually operates at, and it is the reason two events with no connection whatsoever are worth putting in the same video. There is one atmosphere. It is a single, continuous, connected fluid wrapped around the entire planet, and the physical rule governing how much water it can carry at a given temperature applies identically over a cornfield in Henry County, Indiana, and over a volcanic ridge above Nalehu, Hawaii. Different weather, same envelope, same ceiling. And every design number in both places was written down by somebody who reasonably assumed that ceiling was fixed. Go far enough with that thought and it stops being about maps at all. Every civilization that has ever built next to water has done it by learning where the water goes, writing that down, and building outside the line. That is essentially what a floodplain map is. It is the accumulated memory of a river converted into a rule. The entire arrangement depends on the river's future behaving like its past, which is an assumption that held well enough for a very long time to become invisible. Which brings it back down to two very specific places. A stretch of river in central Indiana where a 4-year-old boy died, and where 6 people in total lost their lives, in a flood that beat a record set before anyone alive today was born, in the wrong season, with a quarter of the water sources, and a district on the southern end of the big island of Hawaii, where a Category 1 hurricane that never officially arrived removed occupied houses from their foundations, with nothing but rainfall rate against a volcanic slope. 4,000 miles apart. No connection between them. Both found out in the same week that their worst case was not their worst case. Neither of them needed an extraordinary storm to find that out. That is the thing I want you to leave with. Both of them needed only water arriving faster than the ground could take it, in places whose defences were designed by a record that had quietly stopped being the ceiling. The forecast was right. The warnings went out on time. The people whose job it is to see this coming saw it coming and said so, in writing, days in advance. And the number on the map was still the wrong number. So here is the question that is actually left, and it is not the one the headlines are asking. 24.93 feet is real now. It happened. It is measured, recorded, and permanent. How many flood seasons pass before it becomes the number that anyone is actually protected by?